The moon hung low over the Kentucky hills, a bruised silver eye watching the forest breathe. The air was thick with sap and secrets, every tree creaking like it was straining to remember what it had seen. Travelers never came this far anymore. The roads had long surrendered to moss and silence. But sometimes, when the wind shifted, you could hear laughter drifting through the hollows, thin, childlike, and wrong. Locals spoke of her in hushed tones, the woman with the 14 children, the purest-blooded creature the woods had ever known. No one remembered her real name. Some called her Mother of the Hollow, others said she was born before the town itself. They said she lived with her brother in a cabin of rotting pine, where sunlight could never quite touch the floor. For years, no one dared go near. Those who did were never the same. When the fog rolled in, it carried her voice, soft, beckoning, almost kind. They said she sang lullabies to her children long after they stopped breathing. Or maybe they never stopped. Some nights, lights flickered deep among the trees, moving slow and deliberate, like something watching, waiting. The first real clue came when a drifter stumbled into town clutching a small wooden doll. Its face was carved in uncanny detail, a woman's face, smiling with too many teeth. He said he found it near an old cabin where every mirror had been shattered, and the walls were covered in symbols carved so deep they bled sap like wounds. He died before dawn, his skin cold and pale as river stone, whispering only one word before he went, Mother. The isolated settlement sits deep within the Kentucky woods, a place where maps grow uncertain and the air seems to hum with something ancient. The land is cloaked in mist that never fully lifts, even under the harsh gaze of summer sun. Trees rise so tall and dense that daylight filters through in thin, trembling ribbons, painting the forest floor with patches of gold and shadow. It is in this place, far from the reach of civilization, that a small family built their world, a world of silence, secrecy, and blood. They did not come here by chance. Their ancestors sought refuge generations ago, fleeing persecution and judgment for reasons that were never clearly spoken, though whispers say it had something to do with the bloodline, with keeping it clean. Their isolation became a ritual, passed down like scripture, until the woods themselves seemed to protect them, sealing them off from time. Life in the settlement follows no clock, no calendar. The few who have glimpsed it describe crude log cabins arranged in a small clearing, smoke curling from their chimneys in the winter, vanishing into fog in the spring. There are no roads that lead to it, only winding trails that shift with the seasons, as if the forest conspires to keep strangers away. The people there, what little is known of them, speak rarely, move slowly, and share a gaze that feels older than their faces. Their traditions are strange and private. Some say they mark their children with ash at birth, binding them to the soil. Others claim they never bury their dead, but instead return them to the forest, believing the trees carry their memories upward into the light. For those few who have dared to venture near, the air changes as they approach. The animals grow silent. Birds stop singing. Even the wind seems to hesitate. Hunters tell stories of catching glimpses of figures between the trees, pale, barefoot, watching. The isolation of this place is not only physical but spiritual. It is a sanctuary and a prison, a cradle for something that should have never been born and a tomb for everything that dared to leave. Over the years, the settlement became legend, a ghost of geography whispered among nearby townsfolk as a warning. There are places in these woods where the rules of man no longer matter. There, the blood remembers what time has tried to forget, and the earth itself seems to guard the secret of what still lives within the clearing that no one claims to have seen twice. The woman the villagers spoke of was not just a rumor, she was the kind of story that never needed proof because everyone could feel her presence, even miles away from the woods. They called her many things, the Pure One, the Mother of 14, the Mirror Woman, but never by her real name. No one alive seemed to remember it. Some said she had forgotten it herself, that names were for those who belonged to the world beyond the trees, and she had long ceased to be one of them. Her story began as a whisper about love turned monstrous, about devotion so twisted it circled back into obsession. She lived with her brother, hidden deep within the Kentucky wilderness, and together they claimed to keep their bloodline untouched by the corruption of outsiders. To them, it was purity, to the rest of the world, it was sin. When her first child was born, the midwife who attended fled before dawn, babbling of something unnatural in the baby's eyes, something too knowing. From then on, No one was summoned again. Each birth happened in silence, the cries of newborns swallowed by the forest. 14 children came into the world, and each, the townsfolk said, looked less like a child and more like an echo. They had the same pale skin, the same ash-colored eyes, the same expressionless faces as their mother. Some believed she had given birth not to children but to replicas of herself, each one more perfect than the last, like reflections caught in still water. As the years passed, people in the nearby towns began to vanish. A trapper, a lumberman, a lost traveler. Sometimes they were found wandering days later, dazed, muttering about a family with too many eyes watching from the trees. More often, they were never found at all. It was said that her children played near the edges of the forest, luring wanderers deeper with laughter that sounded almost human. The few who heard it swore it echoed long after the sound should have died, as if the woods themselves had learned her voice. What terrified the people most was not what she had done but what she had become. Some claimed she never aged. Those who had seen her decades apart described her as unchanged, her hair still black as crow feathers, her skin untouched by time. She would appear sometimes at the edge of a field or in the bend of a foggy road, standing perfectly still, watching with that same pale, unblinking gaze. To the villagers, she was no longer a woman but a reminder of what happens when something human tries to outlast its own sin, when the pursuit of purity becomes a curse that breeds itself forever in the dark. The cabin stood in a hollow where the light never seemed to reach, swallowed by the trees and the slow, patient decay of time. Its roof sagged under the weight of moss, and its walls leaned inward as if listening to their own secrets. For decades, the townsfolk said it was cursed ground, a place where even animals refused to tread. The few who had stumbled upon it described a silence so heavy it pressed against the ears, a silence that felt alive. The cabin was said to belong to the woman and her brother, the place where their lineage began and ended, a cradle and a tomb for what they called the pure. It was here, long after they vanished, that a traveler found himself one autumn evening, lost in the labyrinth of the Kentucky woods. He hadn't meant to go that far. His lantern flickered low, the path behind him already consumed by fog. When he saw the shape of the cabin rise out of the mist, it looked less like shelter and more like something waiting. The traveler approached, calling out to see if anyone lived there. No voice answered, only the echo of his own breath. The door, swollen with rot, creaked open with a sound like a sigh. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine resin and something else, something metallic, faintly sweet. The walls were covered in carvings, symbols gouged deep into the wood, spiraling and intersecting like veins. They were not words he recognized, not markings of any known faith. Some of them looked freshly cut, the sap still wet and glistening in the lamplight. As he traced one with trembling fingers, a chill ran up his spine. It was then he noticed that every mirror, every reflective surface in the cabin had been shattered. Shards of glass littered the floor like frost, catching his lantern's flame in broken fragments that flashed and died. On a crude table in the corner lay small wooden dolls, each carved with painstaking detail, 14 in all. Each doll's face was nearly identical, a woman's face frozen in a smile that was both tender and cruel. In the corner, beneath a window blackened with grime, lay a cradle. It rocked slightly though no wind stirred, its rhythm steady as breathing. The traveler fled before dawn, stumbling through the forest until he reached the road. When he returned to town, he spoke little, but his eyes never seemed to focus again. He left the doll he had taken behind the tavern door, and those who saw it swore its smile had widened overnight. The siblings were bound together not only by blood but by belief, a doctrine whispered to them since birth by a father who saw sin in the very idea of difference. He was a man obsessed with the notion of purity, convinced that their family carried something sacred within their veins, something that must never be diluted by the touch of outsiders. In his mind, the world beyond the trees was corrupt, filled with weak men and poisoned women who had long forgotten the old ways. He raised his children in fear and reverence, teaching them that to preserve their line was to preserve God's design. By the time they were old enough to question him, the woods had already sealed around them, and doubt was as dangerous as disobedience. The father spoke often of a blood oath, a vow older than the settlement itself. He claimed it had been taken by their ancestors to protect a divine purity bestowed upon their lineage. One night, under the cold light of the full moon, He gathered his children and made them swear to continue it. The ritual was simple and horrifying. Each sibling cut their palm and let the blood drip into a bowl carved from bone. The father mixed it with ash from the family hearth, then marked their foreheads with the dark paste, murmuring prayers no one outside their bloodline had ever heard. The vow was sealed with silence. None were to speak of it, not even to one another, and from that moment on, the family ceased to see themselves as human. They became keepers of something ancient, guardians of a truth too sacred or too cursed for the rest of the world. When the father died, the brother inherited both his words and his madness. He took his sister's hand not out of desire, but out of duty, convinced that she was the only one worthy to carry their blood forward. She accepted without question, her faith molded by years of confinement and fear. Together they built a world untouched by outsiders, where purity became their prayer and their punishment. Each child born to them was both a triumph and a curse, a reminder of the oath that chained them to their father's delusion. The townsfolk would later find remnants of those rituals etched into the cabin walls, symbols smeared with blood and soot, preserved beneath layers of rot. Some said they were protective marks, others believed they were warnings. But the siblings never saw them as either. To them, the oath was sacred, eternal, something that bound their souls even beyond death. It was not love that united them in the end, but fear, the fear of breaking the promise that had already broken them. As the years rolled by, the woods surrounding the settlement began to take on a strange reputation. People from nearby towns whispered about the way the forest seemed to swallow anyone who ventured too far. Hunters, loggers, travelers passing through, some vanished without a trace, and those few who returned spoke of things that did not belong to this world. They described laughter echoing through the trees, faint and distant, yet close enough to chill the spine. It wasn't the laughter of joy but something hollow, something that carried the cadence of children who didn't know they were dead. These stories spread quietly, growing with each retelling, until the forest itself became a living boundary, a line no sane person crossed after dark. At first, the disappearances were written off as accidents. The Kentucky woods were dense, the terrain treacherous, and the nights darker than ink. But when experienced woodsmen began to vanish, men who knew every creek and ridge by heart, people started to believe there was something else at play. Some claimed they saw figures standing at the tree line at dusk, children with eyes too wide and still, their faces pale as bark. They never spoke, only watched. Others said they heard a woman's lullaby, soft and sweet, drifting between the pines long after midnight. Those who heard it often described a sudden, irresistible pull to follow the sound, as though something inside the melody reached directly into their bones. The townsfolk began to avoid the forest entirely. Churches held special prayers for the missing, though no bodies were ever found. A few brave souls tried to hunt for answers, forming search parties that ventured into the woods with torches and rifles, but most returned within hours, terrified and trembling. They spoke of strange lights moving between the trees, like lanterns carried by invisible hands, and voices calling their names from directions where no one stood. One man said he found small footprints circling his campfire at dawn, though he had been alone all night. Another swore that something had followed him home, whispering just beyond the edge of hearing. With time, the forest reclaimed more than lives, it devoured memory itself. Paths that once led to familiar clearings twisted into new directions, as though the land was rearranging itself to protect a secret. People began to say that the woman's children still lived there, untouched by age, wandering among the trees in a world where time had stopped. They were neither living nor dead, born of a promise that had no end. The cries that echoed through the forest were not warnings but invitations, calling anyone who listened too closely to join the family that had forgotten how to die. The diary was found decades after the last known sighting of the family, buried beneath the warped floorboards of the cabin when a team of surveyors stumbled upon the ruins. It was wrapped in oilcloth, perfectly preserved against the damp, its pages yellowed but intact. The handwriting inside was small and meticulous, each letter pressed into the paper with a deliberate, almost reverent hand. The first pages spoke of daily life in the woods, tending fires, gathering roots, the rhythm of a world without clocks, but as the entries went on, the tone shifted. The voice belonged to one of the 14 children, though the writer never revealed which one. The words carried both fear and devotion, a mind torn between love for the mother who birthed them and terror of what she had become. The diary revealed rituals that blurred the line between faith and madness. The writer described gatherings by candlelight, where the family stood in a circle while their mother recited prayers in a language none of them fully understood. They were told these rituals kept the blood pure, that outsiders would bring disease and decay. Each child was expected to cut their hand and let their blood drip into a shared bowl, which the mother then buried beneath the hearth. It was a covenant, she said, between the living and the dead. The diary mentioned that sometimes she spoke to shadows in the corners of the room, and sometimes the shadows answered. The writer confessed that, as they grew older, they began to see faces in the dark, faces that looked like theirs but twisted, smiling when no one else did. One passage described a night when the mother took the children into the woods, telling them the forest would judge their worth. They stood barefoot in the cold soil while she whispered to the trees, asking them to remember the family's promise. The next morning, one child was missing. The others were told never to speak of it, and the diary's author wrote that afterward, the forest seemed to move differently, as if it were watching them. Later entries became increasingly frantic. The handwriting wavered, the ink blotched with what might have been tears or blood. The writer claimed they could no longer tell who among them was truly alive, that their siblings did not age, and that their mother's reflection appeared in every drop of water they drank. The final entry ended mid-sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted. Beneath it, smeared faintly across the page, were fingerprints the color of rust, and a single word written in a trembling hand, remember. Many decades after the last whisper of the family faded into rumor, a woman appeared in the nearby town, walking out of the Kentucky woods as though the forest itself had released her. It was early winter, the sky dull and heavy with snow, when she emerged onto the old logging road wearing a threadbare shawl and carrying nothing but a small, carved wooden figure in her hand. She looked no older than 30, yet the sheriff, who saw her first, said there was something impossibly ancient in her eyes. Her skin was pale as candle wax, and her hair, dark and heavy, fell in thick strands down her back. When they asked her name, she gave one that hadn't been spoken in over a century, the same name that once belonged to the mother of 14. The townsfolk froze when they heard it, for the stories of that woman had passed through generations like an inherited fear. At first, they thought she was a madwoman, someone playing at legend or lost to her own delusions. But as days passed, unease settled over the town. The woman never slept, or at least, no one ever saw her do so. She would sit outside the old church at dusk, humming lullabies that some of the oldest residents swore their grandparents used to sing, the same songs said to echo through the woods long ago. When questioned about where she came from, she would only smile faintly and say she had come home. No record of her birth existed, no proof of her life beyond the forest. What disturbed people most was not her words but her presence. Around her, clocks would stop for a moment, candles would gutter and die, and dogs refused to go near. One night, a local woman offered her shelter, taking her in from the cold. By morning, the woman of the house was found in her bed, pale and lifeless, her expression peaceful but wrong somehow, like she was dreaming of something that had finally found her. The stranger was gone, leaving behind the small wooden figure she had carried from the woods. It was a carving of a woman with 14 smaller figures beneath her, each holding hands in a perfect circle. The carvings' faces were smoothed with age, but their eyes seemed freshly cut, sharp and watching. People began to whisper that the woman who had returned was not truly human, but something the forest had kept alive, a reflection of the mother who refused to die. Those who saw her last swore the fog followed her steps, and that her shadow moved a heartbeat slower than her body, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. The night the church burned, the air was unnaturally still, heavy with the kind of silence that comes before something sacred turns to ash. The congregation had gathered for an unscheduled midnight sermon, called by the preacher who claimed to have received a vision, a warning about the sins that slept in their blood. The townsfolk filled the pews, their faces pale in the flickering candlelight, listening as the preacher's voice trembled through the old wooden walls. He spoke of impurity hidden among them, of a curse that had walked out of the woods wearing a woman's face. Some said he had seen her himself standing at the tree line, watching him through the mist. His sermon grew louder, more desperate, until it became less a prayer and more a warning. He called the woman a blight, a test of faith sent to remind them of what happens when men turn from God and bow to their own blood. Outside, a cold wind began to rise, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and smoke. As the last hymn began, the candles flickered wildly, then burst all at once, as though snuffed by unseen hands. Someone screamed. In the confusion, the flames appeared racing up the curtains, devouring the wooden beams in seconds. Panic erupted, the doors jammed, and the church filled with smoke. Those who escaped said the fire moved unnaturally, spreading not from one source but from many, as if it were alive, as if the building itself had chosen to burn. By dawn, nothing remained but blackened beams and the cracked stone foundation. Among the ruins, the sheriff found something that chilled even the skeptics: a photograph, perfectly preserved, lying in the center of the ashes. It showed a woman with 14 children gathered around her, each with the same hollow eyes and expressionless faces. The photo was dated more than 100 years earlier, yet the woman in it looked identical to the one who had recently appeared in town. Whispers spread fast after that night. Some believed the preacher had called down the fire himself, that his sermon had invited the curse rather than banished it. Others claimed they saw figures moving through the smoke, children holding hands, walking into the flames without fear. The townsfolk buried what was left of the church and swore never to rebuild it, fearing the land itself had been marked. For weeks afterward, strange footprints appeared in the ash every morning, too small to belong to any adult, circling the place where the photograph had been found. No one ever claimed it, but those who looked upon it too long said they could swear the faces in it were smiling just a little wider each time they looked. The discovery came during a logging project meant to expand the highway cutting through the outskirts of the Kentucky forest, a place most locals avoided even in daylight. The workers had been felling trees for weeks without incident until one of the machines struck something buried beneath the soil, a hollow thud that rang wrong, softer than stone but heavier than wood. When they cleared the earth away, they found bones, small and pale, arranged in strange, deliberate patterns. At first, they assumed they had stumbled upon an old graveyard, perhaps a forgotten family plot from before the Civil War. But as more were uncovered, the unease grew. The bones weren't laid to rest, they were posed, carefully positioned, as if someone had placed them there for a reason. The local authorities were called in, and soon the forest floor turned into a sight of quiet dread. They unearthed skeletons spanning different ages, from infants to adults, yet every one of them carried identical traits. The skulls were near-perfect matches, the jawlines and eye sockets aligned in eerie symmetry. When forensic testing began, the results sent a shiver through everyone involved. The genetic markers from each set of remains were identical, not similar, not familial identical, as though each body had been a copy of the same person. Science struggled to explain it, and the reports were quietly sealed. Unofficially, one coroner described it as a field of reflections, a phrase that spread among the workers like wildfire. Word leaked quickly, and soon the townsfolk connected the finding to the old legend of the woman in the woods. The idea that her children might have lived and died near the settlement unsettled even the skeptics. But what frightened people most was that the bones didn't all seem ancient. Some were fresh enough to still hold traces of marrow, as though they had not been buried long at all. There were whispers that the ground itself had shifted to reveal what it wanted found, that the forest had grown tired of keeping its secret buried. One night, a security guard assigned to watch the site claimed he heard footsteps moving just beyond the floodlights. He followed the sound to the edge of the clearing and saw small impressions forming in the damp soil, footprints appearing one after another, leading deeper into the woods. No one ever found him the next morning, only his flashlight, still on, lying beside a patch of disturbed earth. When they examined it, they found bones beneath once again, smaller this time, as if the forest was still giving back its dead piece by piece, repeating the same face over and over, like a memory that refused to fade. Years after the bones were unearthed and the last of the stories faded into uneasy silence, a young woman arrived in the nearby town claiming to be a descendant of the family from the woods. She was a genealogist by trade, or so she said, drawn by the mystery that had haunted the region for generations. The townsfolk met her with wary curiosity, their fear dulled by time but never gone. She carried with her a box of yellowed letters and brittle photographs, each stamped with the same surname that had long been scrubbed from local records. Her goal, she told the sheriff, was simple: to uncover the truth about her bloodline. But as she delved deeper into the archives, the truth began to uncover her instead. She spent weeks studying what little remained of the family's history. Old journals, death certificates, and parish records all told the same strange story, the same faces appearing again and again under different names, spread across decades. No one aged in the photographs. Children from one generation bore identical features to those who had lived a century earlier. It was as if time had looped, replaying the same life through different vessels. The woman began to feel something stir within her, a familiarity she couldn't explain. The forest called to her in dreams, whispering, breathing, promising. She started to visit the edge of the woods at dusk, listening for the lullaby that the legends said had once drifted through the trees. One night, she followed the sound. Lantern in hand, she walked deep into the forest until she reached the clearing where the cabin once stood. The foundation stones were still there, overgrown with moss, and in the center lay the remains of a hearth. When she knelt beside it, she found symbols carved into the rock, their grooves still sharp despite the passing years. Her fingertips fit perfectly into the markings, and the air around her grew heavy, thick with the scent of pine and decay. She realized then that she wasn't the last of the bloodline, she was its continuation, its vessel. The purity her ancestors had worshipped was not a blessing but a curse, a cycle that could not die because it was never meant to. When dawn came, the woman did not return. A search party followed her trail to the clearing, but the only thing they found was her lantern still burning beside the stones. In the dirt were 14 sets of footprints circling her last steps, all the same size, all leading toward the trees. From that day on, the townsfolk swore the forest had grown quieter, as if it had taken back what belonged to it, sealing the lineage once more in the darkness that had birthed it.